Welcome to our first video lecture of American Nation 1. Today we're going to be talking just briefly about Reconstruction and Jim Crow to give you some context for some of the concepts that you'll be reading about in this PowerPoint and during this chapter. Since this is our first video lecture, I'll go ahead and tell you that as we go through these slides, we won't necessarily be talking about the details on every single one of them. You have the slides for yourself, you have your reading, and you can go through that information on your own. What I'm going to be doing is try to give you an overview, provide some context, give you another way to learn the information, but we won't be spending 50 minutes in a class on this recorded lecture going over this material. So follow along as we go and then supplement through review of the PowerPoint on your own and additional reading in your textbook. In every PowerPoint that you come across, you will see that there are identifications at the very beginning. These are terms that are going to be important for you to make sure that you understand for the exam. On the exam, you will see short IDs or short paragraph answers over some of these terms. So as we go through the notes, make sure that you're paying particular attention to the terms identified. All right, so we're beginning our class here in 1877, but the thing about history is that it's impossible to just drop yourself in a moment in time without understanding the context behind it. So we're actually backing up to the Civil War in order to set the context for this 1877 beginning date. And as we know, in 1865, we ended the Civil War with the North winning over the South and slavery being abolished at that point. So the South has lost the Civil War, and now it's time to figure out how we're going to bring the country back together as a unit. And so the country wants to establish federal control over the South, and they want to readmit the Southern states who have been kicked out of the legislation. They want to remove slavery from state constitutions, and they want to try to provide greater opportunity for Black citizens. And so one of the first attempts to do this is the use of Black codes. Because Southern states had to get rid of slavery in their constitutions, they had to replace, in their opinion, they had to replace that information, those rules, with something else. And so they developed Black codes. Now, the word slavery was never used in these Black codes in the constitutions, but they did serve to deny voting rights, deny the right to serve on juries, limit professions, require official papers to travel. It had to prove employment, they had limited land rights. All of these things applied to Black citizens in the South. So even though slavery was abolished, there was still a situation in which it was very much still prevalent under a different name, Black codes. For instance, if a Black person was walking down the street and was stopped by any white person, they immediately had to prove, they had to pull out papers to prove that they were not loitering, that they were employed, that they had a right to be on that road. And that's not really a situation that we would define as a free situation. There was still a lot of regulations. If you want to follow this link, and I suggest that you do, this is an example of a Black code that would have been in use at the time, Mississippi's Black Code. So you can look at that for more information. Now, it was the Republicans who were in charge of this Reconstruction process that we're in the midst of post-1865, but not all Republicans agreed. There were radical Republicans who wanted more rights for Black citizens, but the average Republican was not actually looking for racial equality, but they wanted to provide protection and opportunity for Black citizens in the South. So one of the things that the average Republican who controlled Congress did was they established the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a group of people who were designed to go down from the North into the South to help create things like hospitals and schools specifically for Black citizens because they were being denied health care and education amongst the white institutions in the South. The Republican Congress also passed 3 amendments. We call them the Civil War Amendments sometimes, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th provided citizenship rights to Black Americans, and the 15th provided voting rights. Note here that voting rights and citizenship rights were not exactly the same thing because just because you were an American citizen didn't necessarily mean that you had the right to vote. For instance, think of women at this time who were citizens but could not vote for many, many years after this. Now, in these initial stages of Reconstruction, there was a lot of or more power and more privilege given to the Black Southerner temporarily. In fact, with the right to vote, Black voters developed a majority in some states like Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. In South Carolina, they controlled the state legislature. Over the first few years of Reconstruction, 600 Black citizens served in state legislatures, 16 served in the South, and 2 served in the Senate. So we do see this moment of empowerment in terms of Black citizens in politics. But this is going to be very scary to the white Southerner, and it's going to be very short-lived. One of the questions that I want you to ask yourself as we continue through this discussion of Reconstruction in the South, setting up our class to begin in 1877, is what is freedom? How do we know when we're free? Because technically, during Reconstruction and in the many years that followed, theoretically, Black citizens were supposed to be free. And yet they weren't really, as we'll begin to discuss. Even though we have this moment of empowerment right after Black citizens get the right to vote, very quickly things like economic independence, power to make family decisions, and the right to have control of community issues are going to be gradually taken from Black citizens through culture, through legislation, through many ways. And so their freedoms are going to be continually limited. And so consider for yourself how you know you're free and what decisions you get to make that show you that you're free. After this moment of power, when Black citizens get more power in the legislation in the states, there's going to be this backlash of the redeemers. They're going to be white citizens, white Democrats primarily, who want to take back the South and limit this potential that Black citizens have. And one of the ways that they're going to do that is through something called sharecropping. White landowners would provide land because they needed somebody to work their land now that slavery was gone. White citizens in the South didn't have anybody to work their land. They certainly didn't know how to do it themselves. And so they have all this land that needs to be worked. Well, meanwhile, Black workers, Black citizens have to prove that they're employed, but they're kept out of most jobs. And so there's a situation in which white people need their land worked and Black people need to show that they're working. And that seems like it's going to be a really good blend here, that white landowners will provide the land and the Black worker will provide the labor, and they'll split the profit in half. But when we assess this situation, what we can see is that it's still a very unfair situation because the white landowners still had all of the power. Consider the fact that Black workers couldn't read. They couldn't read the contract they were signing. They couldn't purchase most things for themselves at the general store. They couldn't purchase medication, clothing, food for themselves because many store owners would refuse them service. And so all of those things have to be done through the white landowner, and it ends up giving him a lot of control over his Black sharecroppers who work his land. At the end of the year, when it comes time to split those profits in half, there's always a reason on the white landowner's part why the Black worker owes him a lot more than was originally agreed. And so sharecropping becomes prevalent in the South, but it is basically slavery by another name. It's another way to keep Black workers tied to the land for the benefit of the white landowners. You can read a lot more about the details of that in your book. Reconstruction will come to an end in 1877 when there is a presidential election. In 1866, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden will run against each other for president. Now, Reconstruction is one of the big issues. Reconstruction is defined as the federal government controlling the South. And so it's going to be a big issue in a presidential election. But by 1877, there are a lot of other factors in play, like a national economic depression. And that's distracting people from the needs of the South. And it becomes the more important issue in 1877. So as these two men run against each other, when they take the vote, it will be too close to tell who actually won this election. And so this will result in deliberations. And when there are deliberations over a presidential election, that's the job of the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives creates a committee that will decide which of these two men won the election. Well, as that committee in the House of Representatives is deliberating, Southern Democrats propose a compromise to this committee. They ask to put Rutherford B. Hayes in office. Normally, Southerners would never want a Republican in office at this point in time. They're Democrats, but they say, go ahead and put Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in office because he can fix the Depression, but in exchange, we want the federal government to stop all oversight of the South. We want them to pull out, we want them to get rid of the Freedmen's Bureau, we want them to stop micromanaging the South's rules in terms of its race relations. And so we won't object to Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president if you agree to this. And the committee in the House of Representatives decides that that would be a good compromise for them to take. And so Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president in 1877, and in exchange for his presidency, he decides to leave the South completely alone as they try to figure out these race relationships that they have now post-Civil War. And that's going to lead to the beginning of what we call the Jim Crow system in the South. Democrats will take over as early as 1870, and they will, as I mentioned before, call themselves the Redeemers, or the quote-unquote saviors of the South. They will begin to put out propaganda that portrays Republicans and Black politicians as corrupt, as thieves, as people who are irresponsible with state funds, and even as people who want to rape white women. These redeemers will portray Black men as desperately eager to rape white women, and in so doing, they will create fear. Now, this is not true. If we look at the statistics, we can see that there is very rarely an instance of a Black man raping a white woman in the South at this time. In fact, it's much more likely to find a white man who rapes a Black woman in the South. But this is a version of propaganda, something that they're putting forth to create a perception, to create an idea. It's not based on fact, but based on agenda. Now, if you go back to your module 1, you'll see that I've provided you with 2 videos. One is a clip from a movie called The Birth of a Nation, and one is a clip of a minstrel show. And so I encourage you to stop and watch both of those videos here and get an idea of this propaganda that I'm talking about in terms of how people are portraying Black men, and specifically Black politicians in the South at this time, in order to be able to exert control over them. The Ku Klux Klan, of course, is going to be a big part of enforcing this new Jim Crow system that references the system of oppression in the South. It's begun in 1865 by a man named General Nathan Bedford Forrest, but at first it's not as violent. It will not become as violent until after Reconstruction ends. At first, it's a society of men who want to experience nostalgia and talk about the quote-unquote good old days of the South. But it's going to become very violent, where its members are going to begin wearing hooded robes, masks. They use terror and violence, and guns, come riding into homes on horsebacks in order to terrorize Black citizens who are not fitting into the new system of oppression, the Jim Crow system in the South. For more information on that, you can look at document 14.7. Congress will attempt to react by saying, with the force bill, okay, you can't do that kind of thing, but that kind of legislation is not always that effective. One of the first ways that these redeemers will make sure to take the power away from Black citizens is by implementing voting restrictions. There are 3 ways that they do this: the poll tax, literacy test, and grandfather clause. The poll tax says that, yes, you can vote, but first you have to pay a large sum of money in order to have the right to vote. And most Black citizens did not have that money. The literacy test said, sure, you can vote, but first you have to prove that you can read. But the reading exams that they would give them were incredibly complex legal documents that they had to read and summarize, and that was above not only most Black citizens' ability, but most white citizens' ability as well, if they chose to implement this. And then finally, the grandfather clause said that if your grandfather could vote, you could be exempt from these other tests. And obviously that's to allow white people to continue to vote, because it was only their grandfathers who could vote, so they could get past the poll tax and the literacy test. Now, these 3 voting restrictions never mention race, and therefore don't violate the 14th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of race. So they are just restrictions placed on a state-by-state basis, but effectively they remove the ability to vote from Black citizens. The Jim Crow laws themselves are going to begin in the 1890s, and it's named, the Jim Crow name, is the name of a popular character in a minstrel show. Now, hopefully just a minute ago when I brought this up to you, you stopped your video, you went and you watched the clip of Birth of the Nation and the clip of the minstrel show that I provided for you, and so you kind of have an idea of what a minstrel show is. Jim Crow was a character from those minstrel shows who was very popular, and he becomes sort of the name of this system of oppression that's going to begin officially in the 1890s. And what Jim Crow does is it establishes segregation. It establishes that Black and white citizens will have different schools, different hospitals, different drinking fountains, different restaurants, different housing areas. Everything will be separated. Now, this is a completely new concept for the South because prior to this, Black and white citizens lived together. In fact, during slavery, people lived in the same house. White owners and Black slaves lived in the same house. There was no desire or call for segregation. What this is going to be is a new form of slavery because slavery is no longer instituted, because a lot of the power that Southern leaders thought they had is gone. They're going to implement segregation as a way to control the population and humiliate them. And so segregation will become a legal system. Jim Crow laws say that Black and white people have to have separate public facilities. In addition to segregation, legal segregation, we also have social customs. An example of a Jim Crow social custom, not one that was a law, but that was just an unspoken rule, would be that Black people could not look white people in the eye as a sign of their humility. If a white man was on a sidewalk and a white woman is coming towards him, he has to step completely off of the sidewalk, allow her to pass, and then he can resume walking. So those would be some of the social customs connected to Jim Crow that weren't actually laws, but just unspoken rules. And this is a system of oppression designed to create a racial hierarchy instead of slavery. Now, one of the questions that you might have immediately is, well, why would Black citizens go along with this when it was so clearly unfair to them? Well, if they didn't, they risked being lynched. Lynched was a brutal, violent method of killing somebody, usually done by a mob. You can see here in these pictures, this is somebody up here on this platform being lynched, and there's a whole crowd gathered around to watch this event. It's an absolutely terrible time in our history where we have a huge increase in lynchings during the time of Jim Crow in order to enforce this system of oppression. Lynching can be done through burning, stabbing, shooting, skinning, all kinds of terrible ways of executing somebody. It did exist prior to 1890, but it wasn't a racial thing. In 1890, it was it could be done anywhere against a person, but in 1890, it becomes specifically a white-on-black crime, specifically targeting Black men in order to keep them in line in the South. Now, this system is going to face a lot of conflict. There are still going to be Black people who fight against this despite the danger of being killed. And one of those people who continues to fight is a man named Homer Plessy. Now, segregation meant that people were on public transportation had to sit in different areas. So, for instance, on trains, there were Black cars of the trains and white cars of the trains. And in 1896, Homer Plessy, a Black man, refuses to sit in the Black section of the train and instead sits in the white section. And he does this on purpose to get arrested. And then once he's arrested, he will have his lawyers push his case all the way to the Supreme Court, hoping that the Supreme Court will look at these segregation laws, these Jim Crow laws, and say they're unconstitutional and overturn the Jim Crow system in the South. But when the Supreme Court sees this case, they vote to uphold segregation by an 8-to-1 vote. And the reason for that is they say that the law only requires equality. It does not require togetherness. And so if people are separate but equal, then that is acceptable by law. Now, of course, we know that in the South there was no equality, separate and unequal in the South. But this was a technicality that allowed the Supreme Court to allow the Southerners to continue to do whatever they wanted to do in the South and not push the issue. And so this Plessy v. Ferguson decision will establish Jim Crow and segregation in the South until the 1960s. So it's a very momentous decision. Now that's the end of our PowerPoint for this particular set of chapters. And as you can see, we did go through that very quickly. We didn't go into much detail. This is to give you context, to hear somebody talking about it. You'll want to go back to this material and be more thorough on your own time through the reading and through the review of the PowerPoint. But I hope that you find this particular video helpful in understanding, and we will move on to the next video when you're ready.